I welcome all of you to the last day of the Gyan course. This is going to be the last lecture, and after this we'll be having only the valedictory session. The last lecture of the course is by Dr. Jason Wirth. This lecture concerns with the indigenous ecology drawn from the traditions around the world, with a special attention to the ways in which sorry, I didn't turn on the microphone on the Google Meet. I welcome all of you to the final day of the Gyan course, and this is going to be the final lecture, a lecture by Professor Jason Wirth, which concerns with the indigenous ecology drawn from the traditions around the world, with a special attention to the ways in which they are responding to an unprecedented situation. This is going to be the last lecture of this Gyan course, and it will be followed by the valedictory session. I welcome all of you to this lecture, and then I invite Dr. Jason Wirth to present his lecture. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for hanging on for all these days. Happy Sunday morning to you. It's Saturday night here. Okay, I'll jump right in. So I'll begin like I have begun for the last couple of nights to just do a little review / expansion, and I'll just expand on two items, gifts, and then something that came up in the discussion, hope. And I'll talk about hope a little bit in detail. I'd like to say one thing about gifts and gift economies. And this has to do also a little bit with Neil's question about how you scale things up. I don't know how we scale things up, but to be able to have something worth scaling up, the work of ecological reason and political ecology, including the indigenous techniques of storytelling. I think it's a mistake simply to say, well, if it's a story and you don't see the discursive arguments, then it's really not part of the philosophical enterprise. I think that's not a good way to read them. But there is something, to use a very Western term, about the staging of the story, and really my class too. It's metanoetic, metanoesis, a Greek term that I suspect most of you know already. Metanoesis, a change of mind, a change of heart, a change of consciousness. Saul on the way to Damascus, and suddenly the scales fall from his eyes. I'd like to say, tying in yesterday to my thoughts tonight, that this metanoesis, since we're using Greek, why not go one more word? A metanoesis that triggers a very deep anamnesis. You remember in Plato, of course, anamnesis, this kind of Wiederbewusstwerden, this becoming conscious or disforgetting, becoming aware. And of course, the thing with the gifts, even in indigenous cultures, the stories metanoetically trigger anamnesis so that we don't forget the gift. It's the gifts and the gift economy from nature that, even when applied to human affairs, brings about, as it did in the Iroquois Confederacy in the northeastern part of where I live, up in upstate New York, brought about the Great Peace. So I'll try to show a little bit of this kind of metanoetic, anamnestic side of stories. But also I want to say something also about hope. And really, not just hope, but hope from below, hope from the ground up. Hope from the middle. I'll begin there's a poet that I love very much. She's like myself, a Zen Buddhist. Her name is Jane Hirschfield. I think she's one of the best poets in the United States right now. And in her last collection of poems, and the last poem in the last collection of her poems, the collection is called The Asking. The poem is called Manifest. She has this very beautiful concluding stanza. Leave one unfraudulent hope, one affection like curtains blown open in wind, whose minutes, seconds, fragrance, choices won't sadden the heart to recall. Leave one unfraudulent hope. And whether things scale up or not, whether metanoetic anamnesis is at all viable, um, I'd like to propose that it's at least an unfraudulent hope, and the heart will not be sad to recall that this is what we explored. And I would say then more about hope. Certainly, I think a sober and rational analysis of the state of affairs in the world right now wouldn't leave anybody, except the most delusional, optimistic. But optimism is a kind of irrational belief that things are just going to get better for whatever, because probably you want them to get better. We may have no reason for optimism, but we have every reason for hope. Hope and optimism are not the same. If we associate hope, say, for example, with one of the German philosophers I've always loved, sometimes nicknamed the Schelling of the 20th century, he's never gotten, I think, the due that he deserves outside of Germany, but Ernst Bloch, one of the great thinkers of hope. And for Bloch, hope is our capacity to imagine a tomorrow that is not already determined by our today. I mean, that we would break the vice grip of the ideological drunkenness of global modernity. Can we do it? I don't know. I hope we can. I would at least venture to say it would be an unfraudulent hope to imagine a not yet, as Bloch says, that we do not fully grasp. What is it? The hope from the middle, before it's too late in global modernity. Bloch, it's nothing other than hoping beyond the day which has become, and only with the farewell to the closed, static concept of being does the real dimension of hope open. The middle, the great open. That is where hope emerges. Put our stock. It's not unfraudulent. I mean, it's not fraudulent to put our stock in the great open, the great middle. Instead, the world is full of propensity towards something, tendency towards something, latency of something. I think of a figure who also got her doctorate in Berlin, Angela Davis, one of the most noted philosophers in my country, and one of the most noted public intellectuals. She insisted through her entire career on the importance of the moral imagination, which she claimed was predicated on the belief that things can change, in the openness of the middle. And the middle was always open. And of course, I think that's something we heard already in Kate's very inaugural lecture. Okay, so those are my two expansion and review comments. But I'd like to now turn to some stories. And not just stories as if I'm illustrating philosophical principles. I think stories that themselves, I like to argue, give us a fuller and richer sense of what philosophy can be. These stories, I'll cite first one of the most interesting translators of indigenous languages, Robert Bringhurst. He's in my bioregion, just north of here on Quadra Island in Canada and British Columbia. He said this about these stories. In North America, they're the indigenous intellectual flora and fauna, the old growth thought forest native to the place. It's as vital to know the stories of your landscape as it is to know which way the river flows and where the sun comes up and where the whirlpools form. I think that's a remarkable formulation. I don't know if you all have been to my bioregion, Cascadia, which Seattle is a part. Um, it is wet. It has still enormous ancient forests, old growth forests. And in those, you see very clearly the interdependent cooperation of everything, even with death. When a tree dies, it becomes a nurse log to give rise to the next generation of trees. And all the interesting work being done on trees in ecology right now, including the German Wohlleben. It's extraordinary, the interaction and interdependence of trees. They're not these little solitary, lonely, solipsistic plants just reaching to the sky. They belong to communities, it turns out, and communities that interact with not just other trees, but with the mycelia and all these other things that help the trees communicate. So I'm going to try to enter tentatively tonight this old growth thought forest, listening in order to remember the future in the failure of global modernity and the onset of the Anthropocene. So make sure everyone can still hear me, right? Yes, yes? Okay. So I'll just contextualize these stories because um, the Anthropocene, in a way, I like to try to think it in the context of these stories. We have entered an era of cannibalism. We've entered into an age or a time in which we eat our own. I do not mean this literally, despite our global cinematic fascination with flesh-eating zombies and ghouls. I mean rather that our global economic practices and the politics that enforce them consume the necessary conditions to sustain life as we know it. We're eating our own, including those of our own species. Okay, so I'm going to look at the two indigenous stories that use the motif of cannibalism, and I'm going to use two related teachings. So, four stories, two longer ones from the Nuchalnath people, and then two related ones that I think that will kind of draw out some of the features of these stories. Nuchalnath people, I'd like to contextualize just what part of the world they're from, since if I'm eating my own, that means I'm eating the very conditions that sustain myself and all my kin, destroying the land that is part of the great middle out of which I and all my kin emerge. So I'd like to contextualize it by just, first of all, the physical location of the first story. I'll be two Nuchalnath stories tonight. So just a brief description of what the land is like. I'll begin with one of the better preserved parts of their original territory. Half of it's a provincial park, and half of it is the Nuchalnath lands. The park itself is extremely rugged. It's on the rugged western coast of Vancouver Island, so that's in British Columbia, but it's not far from Seattle. But unless one has a seaplane, to get there, one must first cross the Strathcona Mountains, which are quite big, and then take a long dirt road for 3 hours to the isolated former mill village of Tassos, or the old gold mining town of Zabalos. From there, one travels by boat through glacier-carved fjords into a chain of small marine islands between Nuchaltlets and Esperanza inlets. The remoteness of the area, far from cars, far from the bustle of industrial living with all its noise pollution, attunes the ear. The raven calls echo through the islands, as do the staccato songs of kingfishers. Sea otters, reintroduced in the 70s after being hunted to local extinction, and the New World fur trade now float on their backs through the waters, cracking open shellfish. And as one attunes one's ear in the quiet, a kind of empty quiet, the whole web, the whole old growth forest, the great old fourth middle, out of which these stories will emerge. Because it's true, these stories belong first to historic peoples. You use them with permission. I'm only using stories that have been released to the public. Um, but they're the curators. They're not the owners of the stories. The stories belong to the land. So as you begin to listen to this place, Heshuk Ish Sawak, Nuchalnath language, it says, everything is oneness, a network of relationships, an interwoven web. Or so say the original inhabitants of this region who lived here since time immemorial, so not like the Aboriginals of Australia, nowhere near like that, but somewhere between 12 and 20,000 years, so an ancient culture. The Nuchalnath, a name now used to correct Captain Cook's confused and errant appellation, Nootka. It means roughly in Nuchalnath language, those who live alongside the rugged Strathcona Mountains. And as one looks at the ruggedness of the land, and one thinks of the longevity of the Nuchalnath people, we realize one thing that I think we should be obvious to everyone, but I just want to just say it. You know, we don't want to romanticize ancient cultures as if this was their default mode, as if somehow there are any human beings who've ever lived that just are naturally one with everything, or one with the land, and don't have war. They're long lived because the ones that didn't figure these things out disappeared. If you make it for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, sometimes up to 60,000 years, you have figured something out. That we look at all the empires that fill up our history books, and we should remember 0.00% of these empires are long-lived. Every single one has failed, and in comparison with indigenous cultures, have failed very quickly in an indigenous second. And we look at the global empire, the most complex and unsustainable empire in human history. And we imagine it's the one with the largest number of possible ways to fail. This is going to be the one that doesn't fail. Yeah. If you begin to study the stories are in part to inculcate practices of deep listening, inculcate practices of attentiveness, inculcate practices of metanoetic anamnesis, a change of mind that comes from remembering who and where and how one is what one is. So I'm going to look at Richard Atleo's beautiful book, Sawak, A Nuchalnath Worldview. And one of the things he begins talking about is Usmich. Usmich in Nuchalnath means something like spiritual preparation, or as Atleo says, attunement to the task of being here, and an acknowledgement of the cognitive limitations of the physical realm. And in Usmich, one begins the search for the meaningful interrelationship between all the variables of existence. I love that phrase. And I've met Atleo several times. He, as a Nuchalnath person, still speaks the Nuchalnath language. The reason why he does is because he was born just as the World War in Europe and the United States was breaking out, World War II. That meant that the boarding schools shut down. You remember the boarding schools? They were taking people in, destroying their language, destroying their culture, taking the language away. It's another way, like killing the buffalo, killing the language. That's in part killing the middle. And he Did not go to the boarding school as a child because they had shut down temporarily because of World War II. So he still had this language. And he went on to be the first indigenous person in the colonial history that is British Columbia to get his doctorate. And so he lived in these two worlds. And I think the tension between the two worlds was one of great anguish for him. And when he spoke about Usmich, this, I don't know, we say really hokey things like vision quest. I think those are not just kind of new agey ways of putting it. But this deep, full conscious striving to search for the meaningful interrelationship between all the variables of existence, to go back into the middle. Um, you know, is that philosophy? And he and I talked about that very directly. He says, well, it involves philosophy. It's a very philosophical thing to do. But philosophy, as it's currently practiced, from the perspective of Usmich, is lopsided. It's too much in your head, too much simply getting the reasonable arguments to work out. It's not metanoetic. It's not place-based. It does not use the whole of consciousness, the whole of oneself. It does not involve all of one's kin. Not the lonely, solitary philosopher, but going out. How do I belong in the interrelationship between all the variables of existence? And by I don't mean the Cartesian I mean I and all my kin, human and non-human. So in Usmich, in a way, you're trying to understand the teachings yourself personally, but the personal understanding of the stories as you go out on these deep, full consciousness searches, this you is not an atom. That's what's falling away in these searches. But you know, the you is going to be yourself and all your kin, human and non-human. But also not just what they are to you in the non-Cartesian sense, but also the one trying to understand the teachings for our time. I mean, it really is a practice of the new old, a practice of prophesying the past, a practice of remembering the future. And so from Atleo, his new Chalnoth name is Umik. There's going to be two stories I'm going to look at. And I think they're both ways of understanding successful practices of Usmich. So one is, and the other is a way of understanding what happens when Usmich fails. Neither of these are Manichaean tales of successful heroes and villains. Both speak to the liminal foibles of human striving, and both have at their core for the Nuchalnit people becoming attuned to, and I just love this word, Kwa'uts. Kwa means something like the way of things. Uts is the owner of the way of things. The owner of the way of things, to which we try to say, how do I belong to the way of things, not a way of things that I own, but it owns me. And Kwa'uts is also the word that sometimes gets kind of hokily translated as, the creator spirit or something like that. But it loses all of its richness. You're going out into the Kwa'uts of the great between. And the first story is a story that, if you've studied this part of the world, it's widely distributed among up and down the coast. But in this area, the trickster figure, which is very important, the trickster figure is the raven, son of Raven. You go a little farther south where there's less rain, it becomes the coyote. You start going farther east, it can become the Iktomi the spider. But in this part of the world, it's the mischievous raven. And the raven is the trickster figure. And this famous story, probably the most famous story found in this entire part of the world, is the story of how Son of Raven steals the light and captures the day in order to deliver the lands from perpetual darkness. I go, first of all, wow. yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? How do we get the light to help us with our darkness? Global modernity. Wow. How do we deliver the lands from perpetual darkness? And so they're all trying to figure this out. The raven and all the other animals. Humans are just an animal among animals. And the first way they figure, well, what we'll do is we'll do a great dance. And the great dancer is the son of deer. The deer does this incredible dance, and it absolutely fails. And then the little wren, the little bird, advises son of raven and his companions. The wren is this little tiny, tiny bird. He's the wisest of all, not this big bear or the son of deer. This little tiny bird is the wise figure, and the ravens are big. I mean, you think of the European crow. The raven is just twice the size, and the ravens in this part of the world are 3 times the size. They're enormous birds, and so Wren has the idea. Here's what you can do. The sun is kept in a box in a land across the sea. The people who live in that land, they love salmon. And really, this part of the world I live in, the people are the salmon people. This was the most significant food source. Um, and so, why don't you become a salmon and swim over there and they'll welcome you? And the chief's daughter would just capture the salmon, and the salmon will be brought in there, and then they would be able to go and steal the sun that's hidden in the box. But the little problem, however, son of Raven, well, he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to do great things. He wanted to leave his mark. He wanted to be somebody. And so he figures, okay, yeah, I should be a salmon. All right. I'll be the biggest salmon you ever saw. And so he becomes this huge salmon. This gigantic salmon starts swimming over across the waters to the land where the sun is stored. And immediately everyone goes, oh my God, there's no salmon that big. It's son of Raven. And of course, they're repelled. And so Wren, having failed again, son of Deer's dance does not work. Son of Raven's dance does not work. The little tiny wren, the little tiny bird comes out and says, okay, well, you got to be something a little not so flashy. How about salmonberry shoots? I mean, if you've ever had salmon berries, you wouldn't get them in a store. They don't taste that good, but they are very nutritious. But they're kind of humble little fruits. So you become little, not just even a bush with the fruits, the little shoots, the early little plants. And Son of Raven goes, yeah, great idea. And he becomes the biggest, largest, most luxurious salmon bush you ever saw, really trying to help things out. And Son of Raven, once again, Atleo says, foiled the plan with egotistical one-upmanship by transforming into the biggest giant salmonberry bush shoot you ever saw. So Wren starts to think, well, how am I going to deal with Son of Raven? Son of Raven's not evil. Son of Raven's just ambitious. Is the part of us that just wants to be something, not be like everything else, but really stand out. You know, the part that makes the emu say, wow, you know, I'm not just a bird among birds. No bird is as fast as me. The birth of the emu principle, as we saw in Aboriginal thinking on the first lecture. So the Wren is a bit of reverse psychology that I always associate with Martin Luther King's famous sermon on the drum major instinct. We all want to be first. We all want to lead the parade. We all want to be the best philosopher ever. We all want to be the best at what we do. So if you want to do that, Martin Luther King Jr. says, then you should be the greatest in love. Be the greatest in justice. Be the greatest thinker of the middle. But turn the egotism of that upside down. And so Wren devised a plan that would take advantage of the Son of Raven's great desire to do great deeds. Here's what you'll do. You'll turn into an extremely tiny and inconspicuous leaf. And you'll float across the water, and the wind will whip you up, and you'll fall into the chief's well. Son of Raven, the one who would be great, becomes tiny and inconspicuous. And as such, he's followed by the chief's daughter, who consequently becomes pregnant and gives birth to Son of Raven as a whining and insufferable baby. And this leads to a series of events in which Son of Raven is eventually able to spirit away the box of daylight in his canoe. Atleo, as he tells this story, links the desire for light, desire for wisdom, desire even to do philosophy, desire for political ecology, desire to be good at ecological reason, to the double-edged sword of Son of Raven's heroism. Although he finally succeeded in becoming small enough to do great deeds, it always seems that human egos are easily overinflated. The emu principle. Yet only in becoming a small leaf can Son of Raven discern where he belongs in the scheme of things, how to cooperate with all the other non-human relatives, each of whom has their own interrelated role to play in liberating the light. Son of Raven appears comic because he takes himself too seriously and cannot always detect how best to belong to the sawak, or oneness of things. Not as a huge salmon, not as a magnificent salmonberry shoot, but a small leaf and a whiny, vulnerable baby. Good teaching, that. A comment on the trickster method, because this is it's not a part of the philosophical canon of methods, but it is a well-worn, well-tried, and powerful indigenous method, the trickster method. You know, Raven does not come across as some horrible villain or somebody you would hate. Raven also is a bit foolish, not because he's stupid, or not because his heart is craven, or because he's cowardly. He wants to be king. He wants to be everything. He wants to be the best. But we see in that very movement this rising above, but in such a way that the comedy of the rising above allows us to see it in ourselves. As we come to see it in ourselves, we find ourselves laughing in recognition at our own folly, at our own egoism. And we begin then to have that fall away. The metanoesis of the Usmich, beginning when we can find a way on an earth over which we lord ourselves, like the Son of Raven, to become that small and inconspicuous little leaf. Only then do we find the light. You know, one of the best descriptions of the trickster method is in Brian Burkhart, who I've talked about the last couple of nights. Although he's Cherokee, he evokes the Lakota trickster figure of Iktomi, this little spider whose self-involved antics always allow us to recognize suddenly our tacitly operating self-importance. And he says this self-importance for Burkhart is the self-importance in which we float free from the land, in which we rise up into global modernity, in which we just deracinate ourselves from ourselves and our relatives. These stories can also open space within the colonial appropriation of the land, that's what Burkhart argues, by exposing, through the trickster method, the arrogance of coming from on high, and the self-serving assumptions that obscure the power of the land. It's in Burkhart's term of art, it's the delocality of settler coloniality. It's on the land without being the land. It takes from the land without realizing that it's taking from itself. And this is what obscures and renders unintelligible the power of land. Now remember, I'm saying these stories belong to the land itself. It's the land speaking. Iktomi, Burckhardt argues, allows the listener to hear something that cannot be meaningfully said directly, at least not in the conceptual and semantic context of delocality, the great global delocality. And so Burckhardt, he's a rascal. Uh, he says, well, what if Iktomi went to graduate school and got a doctorate in philosophy? What then, this little spider? And so part of the book, he tells all these trickster stories. And of course, he's just meditating on what it is to be a Cherokee in the American Philosophical Academy. And he sees Iktomi everywhere. And then finally he concludes, always speaking in Iktomi's voice, Iktomi thinks the Western thinker would make a better Iktomi than Iktomi. Now if we look at ourselves, Son or Raven or the spider, they got nothing on us. As he is better at only seeing himself and the world as a mirror of himself, and does this better than any other trickster in history. Iktomi even wonders if the Western thinker was patting himself on the back while he reached this conclusion. What is comic in the initial foibles of Son or Raven or the spider Iktomi takes on grievous dimensions. So one, Usmich is such a, philosophy is very, very hard work. It's much harder than we thought because it needs all the hard intellectual work that we already know it requires. That's already prodigious. And it needs your entire full being, all of you. And you philosophize not only for yourself, but for your land. It's an enormous responsibility and is conducted in an enormous sense of gratitude. So Usmich is going into that space. But it can also go wrong. And so my second two are the flip side. And so the story I turn to now is the story of Altmaquus, known as the Pitch Woman. Altmaquus is the Pitch Woman. Pitch tar is what she uses. You'll see why in a second. And the Pitch Woman does not live down in the valley by the water with the Nuchalna. She's moved herself up into the mountains because she's grown bigger and bigger and bigger, and she wants to live higher and higher and higher. She lives in the Strathcona, which looks down on the Nuchalna lands. And she lives all by herself, like Polyphemus in the Odyssey. Remember what I've said the last two nights. The indigenous sense of evil, at least in my part of the world, is to live by yourself, to think you're by yourself. The Cartesian stance in which you think you're yourself and therefore you have no relatives, including the land in the middle. Well, she lives by herself like Polyphemus. Lives by herself, it's very hard to have a family, but she wants to have a family and doesn't want to be just all by herself. So what she does is she comes down and she kidnaps children. And when she kidnaps them, she brings them back up into the mountains and then covers their eyes with this pitch. So she blinds the children so they can't see where they belong and to whom they belong. And they can't see their world any longer. This story, as you might imagine, became very, very important story during the onset of settler colonialism. Unlike Son of Raven, who became small and vulnerable, Pitch Woman is huge. And despite her wretched ugliness, she has amassed a huge family of sorts, a huge wealthy array of children. But she has done so because she is taking as hers what was not hers to take. Taking as hers what was not hers to take. by blinding and cutting it off so that it cannot see and it cannot recognize where it is and it cannot resist. Very, very interesting way of understanding the world we're in right now. So after Pitchwoman snatches the chiefess's daughter, she's just collecting them all willy-nilly. The chiefess of the Nuchalnath people is absolutely stricken with grief. And she's crying so profoundly, and she's so incredibly upset that as she cries, mucus begins to come from her mouth and from her nose and from her eyes, and it falls in one big blob on the floor. And out of this horrible mucus is born Son of Mucus. And Son of Mucus coming from, this thing that we'd all think, well, it's abject, The mucus becomes this person, and he goes to seek Pitchwoman, and therefore journeys to her great house in the mountains. And when he arrives, as he comes to liberate the children, he hides in her well. And when Pitchwoman comes out to draw some water, she looks down into the well and sees Son of Mucus's incredibly handsome and beautiful face. But because she's so self-obsessed, because she's still so much Iktomi, who continuously sees the whole world mirroring herself back to herself, she looks down into the well and says, "That's me. Look how, I thought I was ugly. Look how beautiful I am." And she comes out a second time. And she looks down there again and goes, "I'm still so beautiful." But the second time, the well speaks back to her. Son of Mucus speaks back to her and says, "I'm sorry. I'm not you. But I know it's disappointing, but maybe we can do something about it." And she goes, yeah. How did you get so beautiful? Can you show me how to get so beautiful? The promise of a free transformation into beauty was the lure that finally drove Pitchwoman to lay down and say, "Son of Mucus, please give me my beauty treatment." And as she lay down to receive her beauty treatment, Son of Mucus takes a big rock, boom, smashes her head, frees the children. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be heroic or beautiful or to have a family or to live in a house in the mountains. Pitchwoman's failing was to do these things by stealing them, by taking what was not hers to take. And her downfall was of a piece with her life. Something else she wanted to take. Give me beauty. I demand it. I demand that I be beautiful. So we can see that she moved in the exact opposite direction of the trickster figure, Son of Raven, who eventually became small like a leaf. But instead, she became a giant and ugly consumer, ever bigger, ever hungrier, never enough children, always living in an on-demand world. The rise of the Anthropocene is another example of the danger of the blindness of Pitchwoman's means. In wanting an earth more hospitable to our ambitions and dreams, that in itself is not bad. Son of Raven is not malicious. He's a dreamer. But we did not learn to listen to that world. We did not learn how better to belong to it. We made it what we wanted it to be so that we could take from it whatever we wanted. That, by the way, I think is Atleo's secret, uncited, never mentioning his name, summary of John Locke's theory of property. I supplement this story with Robin Wall Kimmerer. I do take some hope in her because All over the world now, she's becoming almost a rock star. She has hit a nerve so sensitive in global consciousness. That little book that was published, expect to sell maybe a few thousand copies and be quickly forgotten, has sold countless copies. And when I've seen her speak, seven, eight, I thought it was like at a rock concert, seven, eight, nine ovations, and young people themselves, you know, couldn't get enough of what she was saying. And in her breakthrough book, Braiding Sweetgrass, a book that fuses botany, science of botany, which she's trained in, she's a botanist in the Western sense, with indigenous wisdom. She gets the two to work together from the middle. In this book, she recounts the story of Wendigo, the cannibalistic monster of the Anishinaabe peoples. And she notes that the story of Wendigo, at least according to the Ojibwe scholar Basil Johnson, the etymology of this term means something like fat excess. But as a way of saying poetically, according to Johnson, thinking only of oneself. That's Wendigo. And Kimmerer speculates that such stories must have arisen from times when food was scarce, and cooperation and sharing were critical to survival. And you think, okay, when no one's looking, I'll just take a little bit more. I'll just I'll eat a little bit heroically. Those who took more than their share and were caught were eventually ostracized, left to roam the wilderness, becoming more and more those who ravenously consumed whatever they wanted. Everything became food. Everything became resource. Wendigo economics. For Kimmerer, and not just for her, increasingly all over the indigenous world, in North America, what we call Turtle Island, the old Haudenosaunee word for what the colonists call North America. Yeah, Wendigo economics. That's the alternative name for capitalism. Kimmerer. We seem to be living in an era of Wendigo economics, of fabricated demand and compulsive overconsumption. What native peoples once sought to rein in, we are now asked to unleash in a systematic policy of sanctioned greed. The noise of the contemporary world order is not just an excess of mechanized noise that makes it difficult to hear the middle. The commons themselves are now literally buried under Wendigo's infrastructure. Winona LaDuke, she's in Minnesota. She actually ran on a ticket with Ralph Nader. Remember in the year 2000 when the Supreme Court gave the election not to Al Gore but to George Bush, and part of the votes had gone to Ralph Nader. His vice presidential candidate was Winona LaDuke, a very famous indigenous activist. And as she has recently protested, if Wendigo economics is theft and greed, Wendigo infrastructures are the material systems that engineer and sustain that violence. In other words, Wendigo infrastructures underpin social organization and its reproduction in logics of capital, property, and accumulation all over life. Wendigo infrastructures are not only built upon the predatory foundations of finance capital, they are, and I'm still quoting, they are cannibalistic. They feed upon their kin, and through them, we are combusting ourselves to oblivion. But this is where we stand in a noisy, rootless, rapacious world. How do you engineer up a tiny leaf being surreptitiously swallowed by the titans of capital. That's my image for my whole course this week. A tiny leaf being surreptitiously swallowed by the titans of capital. But it gets in the system. It is we who have, then I come to my conclusion, it is we who have deluded ourselves that our bodies have finally severed what remains of our relationship with the sustaining flesh of the earth. We live as if the earth were for us and at our disposal. It becomes our property. All the ways that we've talked about Locke. The late Bruno Latour exposed this delusion in his very last book, After Lockdown and Metamorphosis, where he argued that the pandemic provided us with a stark reminder that we are heterotrophs. A heterotroph is an organism that depends on sources outside of themselves to live. Continuing, were we truly autonomous, simply ourselves all by ourselves, we would not be. In retreating to the protective envelopes that helped us evade COVID-19, we were reminded that we are always living in a protective envelope. We're always within the protective membrane of the earth, including its climatic membrane. That we are always first and foremost sheltered by the earth. To be human is always to be in a sort of lockdown, not in the negative sense like, oh my God, I can't live in my on-demand world. It reminded us that it's always locked down, but that's our freedom and our responsibility and the gift. That we're locked into the conditions that make us what we are. If you don't follow them, if we don't live within the sustaining involvement in the current climatic regime of the earth, we're done. We can't be anything. Latour, we need to not forge ahead into the infinite. That's not the call of our time. Not Elon Musk getting $1 trillion and all the big companies and sending penile rockets to space. What we need to learn, Latour says, is to step back, to unplug in the face of the finite. The little leaf. Our delusional economics expose spatial estrangement as our reckless oblivion of our protective, sustaining, ecological membrane. Or as Latour puts it, the world we live in only rarely overlaps with the world we live off. That's the problem. That's the great divide. Those who mend and those who continue to live off the earth without living on the earth. Latour sides with what he calls the menders, who do everything they can, and again I quote again, to conspire with the agencies that have made the places you've landed on habitable. He exposes the extractors who act as if the protective and sustaining membrane of the earth belongs to them and is at their disposal, not the other way around. Such extraction is dishonest, perhaps even delusional. And I think we could just think, for example, one of the examples that always kind of gets in my jaw is this little passing comment in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, a very famous passage in which he analyzes the high use value of water. No water, wow, big trouble. It's incredibly useful, but the problem with water is it's a great example of something that has high use value, but almost no exchange value. Smith. Nothing is more useful than water, but will purchase scarce anything. scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. This is Wendigo, the force of the Anthropocene, natural capital consumed cannibalistically. So that's what I've got for this week. Thank you very, very much for your attention. And I'm eager for questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor. The floor is now open for discussion. Thank you, Professor. The floor is now open for discussion.
Jason, thank you. Let me open discussion today. Very nice stories. I just want to make sure I get your point right. The how's it called? The son of raven, yeah. This figure in becoming a leaf. This is a very nice image because the leaf is small and weak, but also, and I think you even said, but I'm not quite sure, the leaf is riding on the water, traveling with the water. So it is, yes. It is, as Ingold would say, going along with, yeah, not against or using or whatever, but going with and along. So it's not just the weakness and the vulnerability, but also the becoming part of the great middle. Yes. And my question is, do I get you right that that I interpret this in that Sunny Raven, the important step to take is let the ego go. So yes. Yeah, and somehow and then the question is, okay, let the ego go, let become part of the middle, and then the really interesting question is, okay, so would this be addressed as a move from well, this is a dimensional move. This is an ontological move. So is this from yes. ego to self, or would it even be going further from the self to the selfless self, or whatever you might call it?
Yes. And in the Nishitani sense, yes.
And then, I mean, I skipped this part in my lecture, and you missed my lecture anyway because it was during the night, your time. And I skipped it anyway, but I interpreted nature as the in-between, and this comes very similar to your, I think it comes yes. very, very close to your understanding of the great middle. And what I skipped is interpreting the in-between as nothingness, which I think yes. is the final conclusion. Yeah, because this is yes. The middle where everything belongs to, where everything emerges from. Yes. Which is not a static, yes. substantial, but somehow a flowing, emerging middle. And yeah, let me yes. just. I was just curious if I do interpret your stories correctly.
Yeah, you take my meaning precisely and exactly.
Thanks, great, perfect, great.
And I would add to that simply something you also just said. You know, I'm trying to also push towards what renders this world, including our humanity. If you're an atom, you're kind of frozen within some personal substance metaphysics. And if that's itself a manifestation of the substance metaphysics of being or nature, it's all frozen being the thing that it is. Yeah. So Nishitani and the field of emptiness, I think, would be a very I'm really convinced that that is one of the most interesting dialogues we could be having right now. We know the Kuno Ba and the indigenous middle. I think it's deep, but I think I love also the Nuchalnath word for it, the middle. Quauts. It's dynamic because it's not ours. It gives us our ideas, but it also resists the ideas that it gives us. You have to keep being with it. Or I think of the intense seasonality of, for example, Nishitani's culture, Japan, where you still see, at least vestigially, in Japanese culture, this deep seasonal sense that there's no time in which the world is most itself on this day but not that day. There's no Christmas day where the world is really especially real. It's being now and here. Or I think of Chado, the tea ceremony. Ichigo, Ichie. Only this one time, only this one place. Pay attention, become attuned. This is how haiku works. It's listening to quotes. It's not ours, but it's the gift. And it engenders reciprocity, but also movement. And indigenous cultures are, we think tradition, we think of these people frozen in some kind of primitive ideology, but nothing could be farther from the truth. These were extremely dynamic and liberated cultures, deeply attuned to the dynamics of being human in an emplaced way. And these are stories you would tell. And of course, I mentioned the very first night that winter is coming, and that's when these stories are told. And we have to imagine what the scene is like. You're in, at least this part of the world, a long house made out of western red cedar, berries, scented. It smells really good, and it'll be told at night because it's already night by 4 p.m. this far north. And so you have a fire in there, and the fire is also heating up the cedar a little bit, so the scent of the wood is coming out, and you're in darkness except for this fire, and the story is told. And the story, of course, is that you're growing up and preparing for Usmich. You're going to have to get over yourself. We're going to have to get over ourselves. But that's liberation, not loss. So, Niels, I completely agree with you, 100%.
Great, thank you so much. But maybe if there's there's other questions, then I postpone this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Jason, for
Thank
your
you.
enlightening presentation. I am Joby Jose. We have been connected through email.
Yes.
Yeah. My research area is eco-linguistics. So I just want to refer Professor Aaron Stipe, who is my mentor, who speak about stories we live by. Stories we
Yes.
live by. That means that is an induced structure in the minds of the individuals across a culture and influence how they think, talk, and act. So my question is that how should we approach the stories of an indigenous community which is colonized for years? Should we
Yes.
believe them? Should we believe them? Or should we try to decolonize them? I ask this because there is a chance for these stories can have a colonial tone or a threat
Yes.
or influence. That's my first question. Second question,
Yes.
I also see the environmental laws and policies in a colonial country as some kind of stories we live by. They say some
Yes.
inherent stories. So what's your take on that?
Yeah. So I think those are very important questions. It's my hope that at least indirectly all week I've been trying to say that the conditions for hearing these stories or for doing this work, already starting with my first lecture where I tried to go into dialogue and say that you don't dialogue with the indigenous, you don't dialogue with these stories, they are the middle. And you study ecolinguistics, I think it's incredibly interesting. I am not an expert in any indigenous language, although I find them extraordinarily exciting and profound. And I've begun as a very cursory study of Lushootseed. Lushootseed was the original language of Seattle. Sealth. Sealth was a real person. It's named after a great indigenous leader. Um, but the thing that jumps out almost immediately, even in the initial days of studying Lushootseed, and I know it's also the same with Nachalnuth, the language almost sounds like the place. I mean, you begin to see that all languages are beautiful and they're all great and they're elastic and they're dynamic. So they're not stuck in themselves and they can become more nuanced, but they at least show up initially laid over the land. They're delocalized. They're taken from someplace else and just dropped on someplace. And they begin to name all the flora and fauna with metaphors that belong to a European world, to name the animals based on things that they've seen in Africa or Europe. And the language doesn't sound anything like the place. You go, the Lushootseed word for salmon, it sounds, if you've ever seen the salmon runs, when they start going up the streams and the water is, about this high. It's lower than the body of the salmon, and they're pushing themselves along the sand. And the word for salmon sounds like the sound that the salmon's belly makes as they're going up the stream. This, the language of the salmon people. It was the song of their land. And it becomes very obvious that the rhythms of it, the metaphors, they evolved from the land, almost as if you can begin to hear the land speaking. I use that very metaphorically because the trickster always shows us that we can't say these things in an abstract way directly. It's kind of indirectly trying to just metanoetically change the sensibility. And so to your second question and to the problem of the coloniality of this is why I'm insisting that the power of the stories is metanoetic. You have to not change your ideas. Your very cast of mind has to come into crisis and fall away, much in the way that Niels is talking about. Otherwise, even if the stories aren't colonial, even if they're being told to indict the very world that's listening to them, you still hear them in a colonial way. There's no way around that. The stories are preemptively disabled, just like the dialogue is preemptively disabled because you've already tacitly set from the superiority of your interlocutor position the parameters of intelligibility for the dialogue. There's learning new ideas on your terms, but there's no radical change of mind. No moment in which you realize, and again, the metaphor from the Zen tradition is so rich when Huineng, the sixth elder, awakening says, you are this, I am this. And all things say that. It's confirmed by all beings. And that takes more than just winning an intellectual argument. And again, these are ferociously intelligent cultures that thrive. The new generation of indigenous philosophers are, in terms of their analytic prowess, as impressive as anybody. But they have other tricks in their bag. These things are coming in that are expanding metanoetically the field of consciousness to see what else can be heard. So these stories aren't just stories illustrating a point. These stories are changing your mind as you hear them by allowing you to see yourself in such a way that the self that you see is ridiculous. And seen as ridiculous and laughing at yourself, that self also begins to fall away. We don't take ourselves so seriously. It was how we got the light, by becoming a leaf. What could be more precious than that? The light, philosophy, literature, music, life waves worth fighting for. We did not get those because we were the greatest at this or the greatest at that, because we lorded ourselves above things, or that we went over there and stole the sun and said, "Give it to me. You have no right to it." We met it on its own terms. So I think it's extremely important.
So, do you believe that we should decolonize the word indigenous? So,
Yeah, I mean, eventually we'll have to. I think it's a good placeholder because it locates a specific moment in a conversation that is ultimately a dead end, but it starts in these places. And I think we'll hold on to it till we don't need it. But long term, it's not going to be, it's indigenous is not an indigenous word, for example. That's a way of placing yourself vis-a-vis settlers.
Jason, thank you once again for an incredibly moving and wonderful, inspiring lecture. Within the environmental humanities, great store is set on narratives, and the need for new narratives, different narratives, and so on. And I'm actually embarking on a new project on metanoia, actually, and
Yes.
that metanoia as a way of thinking about dynamics of eco-cultural transformation.
Yes.
And the potential role of narrative in that. But my enthusiasm for narrative and for storytelling is haunted by Weber's Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism, because what Weber shows, I think, quite persuasively, is that the new story that Luther came up with had predecessors. There were other people who were doing kind of similar critiques, coming up with kind of similar transformations of the Christian tradition in earlier centuries. And his argument was that it was only when you had a demographic, you had a group of people for whom Protestantism resonated, the new story of Protestantism resonated with their way of life. And so what I'm struggling with is how the transformative power of stories can be effective when those who need to be transformed are resistant. They can't relate to it because their whole way of life is dependent upon a resource-intensive existence. So I guess it's sort of about the pragmatics of entrancing, intriguing, drawing people in for whom the stories don't make sense. They don't make sense because
Yes.
they do not resonate with the way they have to live. They're captured in a certain way of
Yes.
life.
Yes.
And therefore they can't hear the stories, and they hear other stories. They hear right-wing popular stories
Yes.
that tell them
Yes.
that their identity and their purpose is to be, a certain kind of fossil fuel guzzling, white, preferably male American, right? And so,
Yes.
yeah, it's about the pragmatics, really. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. This is another version of the scale-up question, and of course, it's an extremely important question and an extremely difficult one. And here is the vulnerability of my approach. But I think in vulnerability there is where real power is. So if you're going to have a hope, make it an unfraudulent hope. But really, you're putting your hopes on the leaf in the belly of the titans of capital. You're not fighting capital with capital. You're not fighting violence with violence. This is ahimsa. This is nonviolence. But it's also, this story is metanoetic, and the power of metanoesis isn't the power of the gun. It's the power of the embrace. It's the power of sharing. It's the power of a different way of life. And I do find it interesting, as stubborn and as ideologically besotten most of the world has become. It's amazing to watch how this story works on people. It's amazing how when these things just get in people's system, what begins to happen.
And the other
And
thing, oh, sorry, Jason,
please,
go
no,
ahead.
I'm done.
Well,
no,
no,
please, please.
I was just going to say, I mean, the other thing I was thinking about the becoming leaf and flowing in the water, I was actually reminded of Sashwat's eco-politics of becoming imperceptible rather than a direct
Yes.
confrontation. It's looking at what are the openings? What do people actually care about? What language might resonate? And to go
Yes.
with the way, to go, to kind of follow where are the openings rather than go for a direct confrontation and tell people they're stupid. That's never going to work. So it really requires, I think, of people in our kind of field to actually really try and understand
Yes.
the appeal of the unhelpful narratives, and to understand where there are values, where there are imaginaries that could afford a kind of opening to a
Yes.
different story.
Yes, I completely agree. I would say on the one hand, and this is already implied in what you're saying, there's no one way to do this. This is the local plus global plus tension. There's many ways. I mean, it's learning to be in your place, and how is this going to work from where you are. And part of that's just thinking within your own little region of being, and what are its resources and what's blocking those resources. And then second, of course, if you're a mender and you're trying to mend your region, you don't mend your region by saying, son of Raven, you are an arrogant ass and I despise you. No. The trickster method is extremely astute, because what humor does, and this is, I think, so interesting, because I wouldn't say it's a pan-indigenous thing, but it's used very effectively in cultures in far-flung places all over the world. It's a huge feature of indigenous cultures in Turtle Island. It's not that they're being funny or they just have a sardonic sense of humor or being sarcastic. It is a leaf technique. How humor comes in and allows you to see yourself, not by someone telling you you're a jerk. You see yourself, and it's very human. I mean, Wendigo is very human. The capitalism isn't that there are evil people and what's wrong with them. We'll never be able to stop them. How these things get started are very, very human. We were hungry. I was nothing. I had no friends as a child. My parents didn't love me. I haven't been on a date in 10 years. My children hate me. These things, it starts with these sorts of things. He says, I don't want to be nothing. And we can understand that. But of course, it sets into place something that begins to take a very ferocious, and selfishness is always, in the long run, self-destructive. That's its irony. But rather than, remember, these are human beings. We're trying to mend this. Humor goes in. You can see yourself, but not at the end of the barrel of a gun. You can see yourself and laugh at yourself. This is what made, say, for example, Nietzsche so effective, I think, especially within the very kind of grave mood of German philosophy. In the Fröhliche Wissenschaft, trust no master who does not first and foremost laugh at themselves. So Nietzsche, don't read me. Don't take me so seriously. That's not because humor is not hard work or not strategic. It's metanoetic. I see myself, I laugh at myself, and that is how I begin to mend the wound of myself. The one that rose up all the way to the Empyrean heights of global modernity. I'm kind of ridiculous. We're all kind of ridiculous. But that's also the beginning of the metanoesis. And so when you tell the Son of Raven story, inside the longhouse, with the beautiful scent of the western red cedar, and all the darkness being punctuated by the fire, and we begin to see ourselves as the beginning also of overcoming ourselves as our winter ritual. We begin to see the emu within, if you will. And of course, the liberation is, yeah, I'm no better than a rock, but I'm no worse than a rock. It's all precious. It's all the gift. It's all the great middle. And that was exactly in the same greater region where the Nuchalna stories are, is Chief Sealth, Seattle, the one who gave the name to my city. You know, everything is sacred, like rocks and soil. He goes for things that we would take for granted in order to get us to see how deep this point cuts. But its humor is also the beginning of, there was a wonderful exhibition of indigenous art by a wonderful painter who just died a few months ago here in Seattle. And her very opening painting, right as the door as you came in, it said, American art. And at the bottom it said, a 40,000-year-old tradition. And immediately, you're disarmed. You're not attacked, you're disarmed.
Thank you, Jason. I see, yes, there is.
Hello, Jason. Pia here again. Thank you once
Pia.
again for opening our shrunk hearts single-handedly. Truly, this was a wonderful lecture to end our 4-day course on. So thank you for the work that you're doing in expanding our hearts. For reminding us about the radical potential of humor, as you did yesterday on Hope. So that was deeply appreciated. Thank you. I think the questions that we're raising are questions that you've grappled with in your own writing. I wanted to ask if your position on the paper that you have written in 2024, reflecting on these very questions, have evolved since. So I'd just like to go back to the conclusion of the paper where you write, and I'm citing you, you said, what in the meantime to do with the political economy that resists the turn to the political ecology of the sacred webs? How do we even begin to name the terrestrial menders who are orphans in the realm of the current governing institutions? Questions that we've been asking you. And then you go on to cite Latour, but you leave it open-ended, and then you close with Hirschfield's poem that you narrated to us when you started your lecture. But it was an open-ended conclusion, and I was reflecting if your thoughts have developed since on what might, as Kate asked you earlier, what might the pragmatics look like? Because day before yesterday you were talking to us about participatory socialism as a potential starting point of a model that could lead us into an alternative future. Just curious to hear on perhaps some new thoughts that you might have to that open-ended conclusion.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have new thoughts on that, but I would say that my sense of this is, on one hand, the thought itself, if I take it seriously, it's not for me to say, but for us to discuss. That really is part of the change. The kind of philosophical hubris in which I sit here in Seattle and tell the whole world what they should be doing. That is Iktomi, and that is Son of Raven on steroids. I think first of all, it just begins with a change of heart, with metanoesis.
Yeah.
It begins with dialogue. It begins with becoming able to have a dialogue, so becoming the leaf that cooperates with the middle. It begins with listening. It begins with taking very seriously all of the things that repress and inhibit good listening. So participatory, I take the participatory socialism very, very seriously. And not just listening to each other, although that itself would be an enormous change over the last few centuries. But not just us. I might find myself so moved by all these recent works all within the last 10 years on trees. These poor trees, even Deleuze, who I love very much, Deleuze and Guattari, this arborist model. And
Yeah.
I started like hating trees, and then why can't they be rhizomes? Although there are lots of trees in the Northwest that are rhizomes, like the aspen. Um, but trees, of course, are not solitary.
Right. Right. Yeah.
That's a total myth.
Yeah.
They're completely communal creatures, and the intelligence of a tree is not found in the tree. That's just based on a metaphor about how we think we find our intelligence in our head, which is not where it is, by the way, but that's what we think. And we say, well, a tree is not doing calculus and it's not thinking. But the thinking is in the middle of what the trees are participating.
Yeah.
The systems themselves, the regions are figuring things out. And it's very interesting that when you had the Great Council, so one of the early examples of participatory socialism, you always had to assign representatives for the salmon, for the bear, for the western red cedar. They had representation
Right.
to have this discussion.
Right.
So since it doesn't come from on top, and I'm not going to say do X, Y, and Z, and we'll be able to do it. I don't take myself so seriously,
Right.
but I do think coming from a different place opens up extraordinary alliances and makes our hopes less fraudulent.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I do love the metaphor and image of becoming a leaf and becoming imperceptible, and what you said on a tiny leaf being surreptitiously swallowed by the titans of capitalism. I thought that was so eloquently put. Although I'm thinking if this metaphor would be relevant to those who are confronted by the hubris of wanting to be the best, who are, confronted by these large ambitions. But if that metaphor would be unsuited for those who are rendered invisible by this global capitalistic system where they are even smaller than leaves, if that metaphor perhaps is not a universalizable metaphor, it would be appropriate for those who are perhaps responsible for these hierarchies of domination and subjugation, but not for those who are marginalized, not for those who are rendered invisible by our existing power structures. Perhaps for them, becoming a leaf would reinforce those hierarchies. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's a very sensitive, very, very important question, a very delicate question I want to take very seriously. I mean, there is no doubt that the powerful bear a level of responsibility not shared by those that they have rendered invisible and inaudible. That's clearly the case. It doesn't follow, however. I mean, these stories emerged in times in which there were no titans of capital. They were not dealing with these problems. Yet these stories were always told. I mean, there's these problems. They take some ferocious dimensions in global modernity, but the problems don't disappear with the coming undone of global modernity. They're deep problems, and I think that even within these communities, in which they're visible to themselves, not visible to the powerful, of course, but they're visible to each other. Of course, we all struggle with these things. Part of what I like about these stories is they just keep us away from these kind of Manichaean, good versus bad. There's a class of irredeemable powerful, and then there's the invisible. That's all true on one level. It's very important. But these are also subtle, difficult, deeply human problems. And what I like about them, too, is even Pitchwoman, she was ugly. She wanted a family. She wanted to stick out. She wanted to be big. She didn't want to be a leaf. And that's, I think, if you read ancient literature, these are very ancient problems also. So I would hold on to that while also remembering that the context also and the ways that you specify do make an enormous difference. We can't lose that, and we can't conflate. That would, I think, be a disaster. But Usmich belongs to the challenge of being human with all our relatives.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for joining us. We would like to extend our gratitude as a part, on behalf of the organizing committee to you for joining us online. Thank you very much. We'd like to see you soon in person
Yes.
at IIT Kharagpur.
Yes.
With this, we have come to the conclusion of this, not just the lecture, but also the Gyan course, the 5-day-long Gyan course. This will be followed by the valedictory session. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you all in person. I'm determined.
Thank you. This will be now followed by the valedictory session. I request Dr. Sashmai Das to occupy the dais. I request Niels Whitman and Professor K. Trigby to also occupy the dais. Yes. I request Dr. Sashwat Samaidas to hand over the certificate of appreciation to Professor Niels Whitman. Also a memento to Professor Niels Whitman. Thank you. I request Dr. Sashwat Samaidas to present a certificate of appreciation and a memento to Professor K. Trigby. Followed by a memento. Thank you. Now I will read the names of the participants, please. I would like all of the participants to come to the podium and receive their certificates of participation. First, right. A small announcement. Professor Niels Whitman is leaving for the airport now. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. Right. Yes. Thank you, Professor. Thank you. I will request Professor K. Trigby to hand over the certificates of participation to the participants. First, Shuklal Sarin from Jadavpur University. Anansha Bortakur from University of Delhi. Pia Shukani from National University of Singapore. Malika Bhala from Indian Institute of Engineering, Science and Technology, Shibpur. Achla Prakash from Patna University. Sanchita Mahanta from University of North Bengal. Collected.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Sir, I am sent the email.
Yes. We saw that. Right.
Yeah. Sir, so how do I get my certificate?
I'm receiving on your behalf. This is Anand Shah here.
Okay, Anand sir.
I will send to you. Don't worry. I will send to you. We have sent.
Okay, thank you, Anand sir. Thank you. I'll call you. Okay.
Joby Jose from Christ University, Bangalore. Sandhya Parmar from Hemavati Nandan Bahuguna Garhwal University, Uttarakhand. Anis Hembrom from University of Calcutta. PJ Biju Joseph from Loyola College, Chennai. Sen Katiravan K from IIT Madras. So some of you who haven't received the certificates, who are present here but haven't received. In your cases, like we do not have the full information of you. So please, yeah. Yes. You can click the pictures and we'll fill it afterwards. Right. Yes. Please one by one. Okay, maybe we can have a certificate. Rahul from L04 Hyderabad. Usma from Maulana Azad National University, Hyderabad, right? Hyderabad. Zoya from Patna University. So that's all. Yes. Thank you very much. So have your list, right? We have their list. Okay. Can you? I mean, those who haven't received the certificates, can you just fill in the Google form? Right. They have it. Right. Just wait for 5 minutes. We'll get it. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you also everybody online. And with such a shame you were not able to be here in person. But it's so great that you were at least able to follow the proceedings. Thank you so much to all the organisers here and everybody for all their great discussions. And thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. And thank you to all the participants who joined us online despite the disruptions in flight. And thank you for making it online. Thank you very much.